The kill chain was pretty typical. One of Retool's employees was social engineered through texting and phone calls, and this is an oversimplification. The threat actors then did privilege escalation, and then they ended up compromising 27 of Retool's clients, one of whom lost $15 million. The thing that was really interesting in their blog post about this was they said that the caller deepfaked our employee's actual voice. So the employee who fell for the social engineering received a bunch of text messages and then hopped on a call and said that they were kind of suspicious, but then they thought that it was a legitimate person because it sounded like somebody from the IT team that they knew. To my knowledge, this is the first, at least publicly disclosed breach involving generative AI. And then recently, just a few weeks ago, scammers stole $25 million from a financial institution in Hong Kong. The employee received a phishing email, and then they joined a conference, a Zoom call, and Zoom Teams, I don't know what, I'll just say Zoom, like Googling it. And there were people who were deepfaking the CFO and other employees. Turns out I read some recent reports a couple days ago after I made the slide deck. They didn't really interact with the employee. They just told the employee what to do. But as I was talking with people about this kind of last summer and fall, we had the concern that with advancements in generative AI, it was going to get to the point where you could deepfake somebody on a live call, and that's already been done. So, yeah, so they ended up transferring $25 million. Details are still kind of sparse, but yeah. But all of this leads to the question, which is, how do we validate someone's identity in a world of deepfakes? Because in the past, you could just call somebody on the phone or hop on a Zoom call with them and be like, cool, this sounds like them, it's them. Same thing with a video call, right? So how do we do that when we can't rely on those methods? So today in this talk, here's the agenda, we're going to talk about the scope. Generative AI has broad implications across society within cybersecurity, positive and negative, but we're going to focus specifically on some very specific areas within cybersecurity. We're then going to do a threat modeling exercise to help us better understand the risks and threats and then how we mitigate those. And then the solutions I'm going to present today are intended to be actionable, like you can take this back to your organization and start using these. This is also a new topic, I'll talk about it at the end, but this is by no means, I don't intend this to be a be-all solution or a panacea for everything, so I think it's important that as a community we continue to discuss these things, come up with ideas, and yeah, but yeah, we'll talk about the solutions. So, starting off on a very big picture, generative AI impacts a lot of different parts of society, which I think most or all of us in the room are aware of. So there's the disinformation that we typically think of. There's education, right? How do you validate that a student wrote their essay and that they're actually like learning? And other topics. There's sexual abuse and harassment. And this isn't the focus of my talk, but I do want to take a second about it. So, since this is a really serious problem. So a few weeks ago, Taylor Swift had some deep fake nudes made of her that were, some really bad things. This is by no means a new problem, but with generative AI, it makes it extremely easy to make realistic videos, non-consensual videos. So, and this problem largely stems from boys and men who are creating these videos. And the impacts can be horrific, right? It can be, can enhance the ability to do revenge porn. You can harass somebody in your junior high because you have their yearbook photo. So primarily speaking to those who are also male or male presenting, since our gender seems to be the one that does most of this, we need to make sure that we are treating everybody, but especially women or those who are women presenting, with respect and kindness, and that we make sure everything's consensual when it's sexual. And then whenever we have an opportunity to, we can mentor other men and especially boys and help them learn and navigate this, right? Like, there are definitely influencers out there who support this type of stuff. So this is a large issue. I just wanted to take a second to talk about that. And then, obviously that's why we're here. The other impact is within cybersecurity and scams. So within cyber, there's broad impacts. There's compliance reasons, right? Like, what are the legal things we can and can't do? There's, we can use Gen AI to help us write code. And then there's offensive and defensive. There's a number of things here. Prompt injection is really cool. I'm not sponsored by them or related to them. There's a group out there called Lakera AI, and they have this game called Gandalf, and you can basically experiment with prompt injection. Highly recommend it. Super fun. And then, of course, the other thing is social engineering. So with social engineering, within social engineering, threat actors can now use this to augment their capabilities, like the stories we talked about. So there's account takeover, they can transfer funds, they can more easily get you to send them a $500 gift card. That's always a favorite. And like I said previously, we could rely on just simple methods, but now those don't work. So to figure out the solutions, we need to first do, I figure the best way to figure this out is to do a basic threat model. So hope that's large enough to see. So at the top, we've got impersonating existing. We're going to look at this within the context of impersonating an existing employee. One of the other aspects we're not going to cover today, but is also important, is validating employees when they're hired. Now, there are background checks, there are other checks, but we know that North Korea has been hopping on Zoom calls and getting hired as developers at a bunch of companies. And generative AI is going to augment their ability to do that, because right now they usually just leave the camera off and say, oh, my camera's not working. But yeah, we're not going to talk about that in the scope. We're going to focus on our existing employees. So one of the ways they can do this is through a video call. They can get voice recordings of your CEO, your IT personnel, other staff. You can grab pictures from anywhere. More data is always better. And then some of the ways they can do it, you can't see it super well, but you can get voice recordings from people's voicemails, like, hi, my name's Andrew, thanks for, I couldn't answer the phone right now, leave me a message. YouTube, TV interviews, you can hop on a sales pitch with a vendor who's gonna give you like a free duffel bag or something. You could be giving a presentation at CactusCon, right? And then you can get pictures from a variety of sources, including blogs and the news. They can augment emails and text messages by creating better lookalike websites, right? You can make the language that you're using sound a lot more natural. Both like in a phishing email, but if you have a texting conversation with somebody, there's a really good South Park clip about this. Shoot, I'm forgetting, I think it's Kenny, is like texting his girlfriend, and he's just like using ChatGPT to write all those responses. So it's a good clip. And then also like their writing style, right? Like each person has a unique writing style and writing traits, and you could use that to impersonate them, right? So if they write a blog post, you could gather that data, analyze it, and then go from there. So people have been doing lookalike websites for a long time, but this is now a lot easier to do with different tooling. One of them is by ABI, it's called Screenshot to Code. Really cool tool. Basically, you just take a screenshot of any website, and it will automatically generate all the HTML and CSS for you. And so it's a pretty cool tool, but can also be abused. And then we also talked about like natural sounding language, pulls and stuff from the other side that we already talked about. And then for them to bypass access controls, this is talking about kind of like existing processes we already have within our organizations. So it could be like conditional access, it could be hopping, if your organization already like calls to confirm that somebody is doing a password reset, they could do that. One of them is you can create fake IDs. Joseph Cox has a whole article on this, but he was able to use a kind of, I think it's a newish service that'll create fake IDs for you, and he was able to use this to successfully authenticate with multiple identification sites. So I don't know which ones he tested, but for example, a popular one is ID.me. Again, I don't know if they were involved in his research, but they have you, like, they scan your face, they have you show them your ID card, and then they validate if you are who you say you are. So that can now be tricked. There's also keystroke dynamics, right? Like, that's a lot more advanced. And then they can, all of these things that they can do can also be augmented by traditional things. So using an IP, like coming from an IP that's near where the employee lives, right? So if they live in Kansas, the threat actor could also use an IP from Kansas. There's MFA fatigue, and bad culture is probably always the biggest one, in my opinion. Great. So looking at this, we can't prevent people from posting up on YouTube, from writing a blog, and I would also argue as organizations generally should not do that. There are some exceptions, right? Like you don't want to go write a blog post about your classified research that you did, but generally we can't prevent people from doing this. But what we can do is we can detect things upstream, right? So we can't implement technical controls to say like, hey, we're gonna block, these websites, because that's not really going to be effective in this context. But we can do some things to detect fake video calls, fake phone calls, and other impersonation techniques. So what we're going to do is use a validation in depth approach. This is the same as defense in depth, but instead of just relying on one, we're going to use multiple. And we're going to look at it from two perspectives. We're going to look at it from the employee side, right? What guidance can we give our employees, and then our internal processes. And this is going to be the primary focus, right? So what can we do as organizations to validate someone's identity when they hopped on a Zoom call, they think it's the CEO telling them to go buy a $500 Amazon gift card. How do we validate that that's not them, right? And hopefully your CEO is not asking people to go buy gift cards. All right, on the employee side, the best thing is just to not read your emails or respond ever. I love that meme so much. In my opinion, I think the best thing to do is to augment programs we already have in place. People already struggle with social engineering, which we are well aware of. So adding more things for them to do is not going to be helpful. But what we can do is tweak the existing advice that we do have. And then we can also update our trainings on how we detect and how employees can report Gen AI, right? Like there's often a report phishing button in inboxes. We can set up similar processes like that. So on the internal side, and by the way, this image was made with Google Gemini, formerly Bard. So there are some good use cases with AI. And this is going to be what the rest of the talk is about. So organizations need to take primary responsibility for validating people's identity. The reason for this is the methods we're going to talk about are not accessible to individual employees, nor in my opinion should they be, because it requires some privileged access, like to logs. Obviously, implement validation in depth methods that we'll talk about and adjust policies as needed. Again, like no breach happens, well, very few breaches happen because of a single point of failure. In the case of the Hong Kong breach, what they could have done, and I'm speaking generally here because there wasn't a lot of information, but that organization could have required 2 people to approve money transfers, and that could have prevented that them from losing $25 million. So again, within the context, there's a lot of other things. We're just narrowing this down a bit. And then, as we know, a strong culture is extremely vital. If you have a culture where your employees are afraid of being able to question or challenge things, you are almost inevitably going to have somebody fall for a phishing email. On the flip side, if you have a culture where people are open and it's okay to question things and to validate, and you are okay with people taking their time rather than rushing and breaking things, you have a better chance of things turning out okay. At worst, somebody falls for a phishing email, but you're in a better place to handle remediation. There was an organization, speaking of bad culture, who had their CEO was berated their employees a lot and had no patience, and their head of HR fell for a phishing email that claimed to be the CEO, and because the head of HR was afraid of questioning the CEO, they sent over a bunch of W-2s to the threat actor. So yeah, definitely have a good culture in place. That is something that could have prevented that. All right, so a few things as we talk about these actionable methods. I'm going to discuss them individually. I'm going to talk about both their pros and cons, and then we'll put them together within a maturity graph. I'm going to have a little visual for that, and then we'll walk through some examples of how this would work. And then the other thing is, to be most effective, these methods, first off, they need to be adaptable, right? We need to adapt them to our risks and organizational budgets. Some of the things in here that I'm going to talk about, some organizations can't often afford to do, especially small and medium businesses. We also need to adjust it based on your organization's size and the industry it's in. So if you're dealing with classified material, some of these methods might be a baseline and you might have others. It just depends. And then we also need to account for a remote, in-person, and hybrid workforce. But as a caveat with that, even when people have fully returned to the office, people still work from home. There are weekends where people aren't in the office, hopefully, unless you're in accounting during tax season, bless your souls. Right, so we need to find ways to validate them remotely. We also need to make these repeatable, right, so they're easy to follow, and where possible, technical solutions like logs and other things are going to be better than manual verification, like doing something manually that takes time. That's not always feasible, but the ideal is to do things that are technical, and then we need to keep it simple as possible, because once it becomes complex, you just can't action it, right? And some of I'm sure there are some much more complex methods, and they probably are appropriate for high risk areas, but the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is very broad, and it's intended to cover all of our bases and be as a baseline. And then we need to keep a few things in mind. This is the last slide before we jump into the validation methods. So the first is, none of these are individually going to be 100% secure, and even together they're not going to be 100% secure. But adding multiple layers is going to make it increasingly difficult for threat actors to succeed. And once it gets to a point where it's not profitable for them, it'll deter them. And then the second is, as organizations increase their maturity, generally they should add on to previous methods. There are some that you might take away, but generally the things I'm going to propose you would want to use yeah, you just want to add on to them. All right, so there are 11 methods that I'll be talking about. So the first one, this is the easiest. If you're in person full-time or hybrid and you're in the office, it's extremely simple to walk down the hall and make sure somebody is who they say they are. It's highly reliable, but there are cons. There's, like we've talked about, there's a remote workforce. People work from home late at night, and yeah. But this is very effective. So if you have people in the office, this is going to be the most effective. The second one is to hop on a video call, right? So if somebody says, anyway, I'll talk about an example later, but we can get audio and visual confirmation, and almost everybody knows how to use Zoom or Google Meet or Teams or whatever you're using. The downside is like we've talked about, you can spoof both audio and visuals, and then your government IDs can also be spoofed. And I bring that up because one way you can augment this is by hopping onto a Zoom call and having somebody show their identity and matching it with what's in your HR system, right? So when you go through and you do your, I think it's the I-9 verification, you have to give them a copy of one of your IDs, and you could validate if that matches. Again, that can be spoofed, so it's not going to always be reliable. The other way is to message the people through your corporate Slack or Teams or whatever you're using. If you're in a situation where you've locked an employee's account, usually they stay signed into Slack, at least on their phone. Slack doesn't, on the back end, there's not a way with the SSO integration to actually revoke sessions. So yeah, they will stay signed in. And then it's easy to do, but at the same time, the threat actor might control the device that Slack is on, whether they've registered the threat actor's registered their own device and put it in the employee's name, or they've compromised, the laptop or the phone of the employee. The next one is device fingerprint matching. So in this context, we're going to look at things like historical IP addresses and geo-IP. Right now, geo-IP, as a note, I'm sure you're aware, is finicky. Not all these solutions are accurate, but if you're using a tool that consistently mislocates people, at least it's consistent, and you can see if it's inconsistent, right? You can look at their OS and their browser, and for both of those, including their version numbers, the user agents, device IDs. Depending on the log streams you have, these can be extremely helpful. So the idea would be like if you hop on a Zoom call with somebody, you can pull the IP address from that Zoom call and see if it matches what you've seen historically in their logs, right? Or you can look and see like, hey, did this person SSO into Zoom? And if they did, does it match their history? Do we see any weird logins recently, type of thing? So the pros of this, if you have the logs, it can be relatively quick to check. The downside, come bottom right, is not all organizations have these logs or even train their staff on how to query those logs. And another benefit is it can augment your video call and other requests. The downsides, though, are you may have a really persistent threat actor who, I'm not talking about APT when I use persistent, I'm just talking about somebody who really wants to go after your organization. They could imitate or spoof the IP. They could use a proxy that's right next to your employee's city. And then your employee might be traveling. They might have just registered a new device, right? So it's not foolproof, but it can be useful. This one's interesting. Again, I wanted to apply this to organizations of all sizes and situations, and this will apply for I think the next one. Usually, if not always, employees are required to fill in an emergency contact when they get employed. So one thing you could do is you could call or contact that emergency person, right? So the pros of this are that person knows the person. Oftentimes they're a partner and they live together so they could validate. Or this emergency contact could also call your employee and validate for you. But there are a lot of cons to this one. This one's not my favorite, but it could work. That emergency contact might not be available. The threat actor could, do a SIM swap and take over the emergency contact's phone number, or they could have broken into your HR system and swapped out the number there. If they're already in your HR system, they're probably not doing this aspect though, but again, thinking about all the risks there. And the emergency contact may not actually have been written down, and it may not be up to date. So those are some of the cons. This one is where you could have an employee who lives, like you have a second employee, call him person B, lives next to your primary employee who is being impersonated by threat actors. You can have employee B go to this person's house. The pros of this are it's like physical, it's in person, right? And then this can also be really easy for small and medium businesses to do. Especially at startups, it's often a tight-knit culture. You often have friends. Not always, but often people live near each other or are friends, so they can go check in on them. There are a number of cons to this, though, which is it's not reliable, right? Like one of the things is we want something that's repeatable. We can't always rely on another person to do it. Your employee may live somewhere, like you might have an employee up in like Oregon, but most of your employee base is down in like Texas or New Mexico, and you can't. Like nobody can go drive up there to validate. Your other employee may not be available or even want to do this, take time out of their day to go drive, and it could just end up wasting time, right? Like if the employee B shows up to the other person's house and they're not home, like, it wouldn't help. Another method is you could ask the person to send an email from their personal email. Usually those are listed in HR systems, right? Pro of this is it's straightforward. There's a lot of cons, the biggest being the threat actor could already control that email address. So, when we show the visual, I'll talk about how that fits in. And for organizations that have very minimal security budgets and are not mature, like doing something is better than nothing. So that's why I added number 7. You could also use PGP signed emails, right? The pros are it can't be spoofed with an asterisk of if the threat actor knows that, knows the passphrase for that PGP key. So, for example, the LastPass breach that happened a year or two ago, it's still being used to break into crypto wallets. So you could have your password manager breached. Another con is it requires technical training and setup. So you have to like walk your employees through how to do this, and you might end up just walking through the threat. You might end up walking the threat actor through your internal process. But another pro is we can publicly verify PGP key ownership. So it can be a helpful method. This one is certification-based MFA. This one is for more mature organizations because you should also have your devices centrally managed before you're doing this. The reason I like it is it's a very strong proof as work accounts can only come from devices that are using this. That includes both like laptops as well as mobile phones. If you have a bring your own device policy, it's going to cover that. Covers virtual machines, whatever you're using. The cons, though, is not everybody is managing their devices, especially when it comes to bring your own devices on mobile. That's starting to change, but yeah, and that's also a finicky topic with some employee privacy concerns. We're not going to talk about it here, but generally that is a good thing to do. And then, of course, the threat actor might have compromised the device. So if you're unfamiliar with how certification-based MFA works, basically you put an X509 certificate on the machine, and then all of the requests to sign in or keep your session going, check that certificate. And if it's valid, the session continues or they log in. Otherwise, they're denied access. So it basically limits them to approved devices. The 10th one is to use hardware MFA keys, right? These are great, especially if you're using biometrics. They can't be spoofed, however, they can be lost and stolen. And then you could also use this to authenticate your PGP key. It could make that process simpler. The biggest con, though, is that these are generally expensive, and if you're already at an organization struggling to get any money for a security budget, your money is probably better spent elsewhere. Right, at that point, you probably have a relatively immature or emerging security program. And even if your company can afford it, it might only be feasible for a subset, like those with privileged access. People lose these keys, so what do you do if a couple of your marketing employees lose their keys every 6 months, right? That just increases costs. A lot of organizations do this, and they do it successfully for all their employees, like Google's one, but again, there are some cons, and it doesn't work for everybody. And then the last one, and we'll talk about this, this is where you have a remote employee and you basically fly them into your office. So like the first one we talked about, it's highly reliable, but again, this is a very expensive method, both in time and cost. It could lead to your employee not having access to the systems for multiple days. So really this should only be used for extremely sensitive accounts and or when all other methods have failed. So I wouldn't recommend it, but it is an option. But hopefully we can use it. Ideally, these other methods will, we won't have to do this. All right, so as I talked about earlier, the reliability in terms of identifying somebody's, did I say that? Of validating somebody's identity increases as we use multiple methods. So these ones are going to result in the best, these are gonna be this is the most reliable combination. Video call that you've augmented with the government ID, you do device fingerprint matching, and then you use cert-based MFA and or hardware MFA. The reasons for this, in my opinion, are everybody knows how to do video calls. Not every threat actor is going to take the time to use Gen AI to impersonate your executive or other employee on a Zoom call. It's still possible, but at this point, it doesn't seem that they're using IDs, right? So if you say like, hey, can I see your driver's license? The threat actor might not pull it up. Device fingerprinting is great. This is great in a number of other scenarios. And then the cert-based and hardware-based MFA are also reliable. But again, not every organization can do this. So what we're gonna do is, in the next slide, I've got a chart we'll go over, and it's going to be a maturity model. And this is gonna visually help organizations understand their options and limitations, and then they can choose the best combination for their situation. And lastly, it can also provide an easy to digest roadmap on, all right, how do we do better? How do we become better? All right, so on this graph, on the x-axis is the maturity level. You can also substitute that for cost, generally speaking. And then on the y-axis is impact from impersonation. So if somebody impersonates your CFO and gets you to transfer 25 million, that is an extremely high impact. If they're impersonating like one of your internal employee training employees, the impact's gonna be more minimal, relatively speaking. So the first one is in person, right? You don't need to, this is applicable for all impact levels, and it's really easy to do. I'm putting it on the lower end because not everybody's in the office, and nobody's in the office all the time anyway. Getting more mature is where you're validating through video calls or a Slack DM or Teams or whatever you're using. There are limitations to this like we've talked about. Device fingerprinting is great, and you should ideally use this for all scenarios. I'm putting it in the middle because not all organizations have these logs or know how to, or if they do, they sometimes don't know how to look at them. So there is a bit of work there that needs to be done. We talked about emergency contacts. This isn't super reliable, and you don't want to do it in every single case. Like, you don't want to be calling, if you're getting, if you're having Gen AI social engineering attempts, 5 times a day, calling the emergency contact isn't going to work. It's also going to take extra time, and you can't get people back to work quickly. Same thing with an employee who lives nearby and checking. Personal email, you can use it, but again, it's very low maturity. You should ideally only be using it for low impact situations, if at all. But if the only options you really have are in-person, personal email, and a Zoom call, like, that's great, right? Like, that's better than doing nothing and just assuming. Because as I've worked with like small businesses up to multinationals, I've seen a whole range. I've seen organizations that are just totally on board with getting appropriate funding for security. I've seen organizations that do not want to invest in security at all, and it's like, yeah. So again, we're going to account for all scenarios, not just the ideal ones. PGP email, you can use that for all scenarios, but it does require training and other processes to support it, so it's more mature. Cert-based MFA, I'm calling that even more mature because you have to manage your devices and then implement this, and there's some challenges to this. There's an organization that I worked at in the past where their employees would travel a lot, and they would be basically like, they would need to log into their work accounts on loaned laptops. Long story short, they were like basically setting up events, and they would have to like log into other laptops, and then temporarily, so cert-based MFA was going to interfere with those operations. And then hardware MFA, I'm putting it as a high maturity level primarily because of the cost around that, and then what do we do if people are losing stuff all the time? And then in-person remote, like we talked about, right? Like, this might be the person who has global admin access to your Google workspace, like your Google workspace, or has root access in AWS, right? Because somebody in your organization has to. So, yeah. So that one's not ideal. All right. So those are the methods for validating identity, and I'm going to walk through 2 examples. The first is there's a video call with the head of HR, and the second is a password reset request. So with the video call for HR, so the scenario is the security team's been asked by Anya to help with this issue. By the way, if you're a fan of Spy X Family, this is for you as well. I love that show, highly recommend it. So Lloyd, who's a manager, received an email with a Zoom link to meet with the head of HR, who's named Yor, about one of his, I messed up the names. Anyway, about one of his employees. Lloyd joins the call. While talking, something seems off, so he's contacted security. And for context, they're not using cert-based or hardware-based MFA, and she is working remote. So the first thing they would do is hop on a Zoom call and check the identification. In this case, we're going to presume that yours shows her ID and it matches what's in the HR system, right? Driver's license numbers match. Why is this not going forward? There we go. Next, the security team will sign in and analyze the logs. What's happening right now matches what's happened historically. Because Yor is the head of HR and has highly sensitive access, they have her send a PGP signed email from her work account. Security validates it, and in this case, the security team assesses that this actually is Yor. So it was a legitimate situation. All right, the second situation is with a password reset request. So late one night, the IT team receives an email that from Anya's personal email, like her Gmail or Yahoo account, stating that she needs help signing in, right? And in this organization, it's not uncommon. Like, I've seen it before where an employee gets locked out. They're like, hi, I can't get back in. The only way I know how to contact you is through my personal email. Anya says she was locked out and that the automated reset process is not working. So before sending Anya a password reset, the IT team or IT asks security to help validate Anya's identity. And then we're also going to assume that Anya has returned to the office and is a member of the DevOps team with access to production, and hardware MFA keys are required. So, but again, this is late at night, so she's may not be in the office. Or this, but yeah, this is just to highlight that we need to consider remote solutions at all times. So again, we do the Zoom ID verification, it matches, they analyze the logs, and they see that Anya's phone, quote unquote, that they had the Zoom call in does not match her registered and managed device. They then send Anya a Slack DM, and Anya says, why are you bothering me? It's the Super Bowl, AKA the Usher concert that the NFL attended. That was really nice of them. I love football, so that was fun. And then the security team assesses that this is not Anya, so they Slack her back and say, hey, you need to reset your personal email. Looks like it's been compromised. When you come back into the office tomorrow, we can help you. So those are the two scenarios. And then in conclusion, generative AI makes social engineering impersonation attacks so much easier to do. It's both raising the level of complexity while also lowering the barrier to entry, the technical feasibility. Our old methods of validating, just hopping on a phone call or Zoom call, are inadequate. But we can use a validation and in-depth approach to validate people's identities. So as far as next steps go for this topic, we need to have more conversations, right? Any idea is going to benefit from having lots of people talking about it. So the more people we have talking about this, we'll get more solutions. I'm sure there's stuff I didn't think of, right? And there are lots of nuances. So we also want to, over time, adapt this to specific situations. But as now, this is a good baseline, which gets into broadening the scope. In addition to looking at niche cases, we also want to look at how do we give guidelines for individuals and their families, right? What do you do when somebody, oh no, this actually happened, where someone got a phone call that was their daughter's voice saying that she'd been kidnapped, and the kidnappers needed to pay, or the parents needed to pay a ransom for her to be safe. Well, it was generative AI, right? How do we handle those scenarios? In a case like that, I think a family shared password or just phrase is a good idea. It can be really simple. I do not think it's a good idea for organizations because you have to write that down somewhere and you have to make sure everybody remembers it. And they're probably almost certainly going to forget because they're not looking at it ever. And then the threat actor might have access to your internal systems anyway, so they might know that. And then we also want to adjust with empirical data, right? Originally NIST said that you should reset your passwords every 90 days. Turns out, after now we have data on that, that's often not ideal. The guidance is for standard user accounts, just reset if you have a data breach, right? So we want to adjust these methods as we get empirical data, as we have experiences with it, and that'll help make it better. So that is my presentation today, and I'll open it up for questions. One second. Okay, go ahead. The question was, how do we, is there a public forum or something for keeping the conversations going? I don't have a public forum right now, but the team and I that I'm on, we're having these conversations with ourselves and other people in the industry. So I don't have a forum at the moment, but yeah, I think just at least what I intended was to keep talking with other security people about it as the conversation comes up and as there's time for it. So, yeah.
Seems to me that this continues to push the integration of like IT and support desk or help desk with cybersecurity inside organizations. Some organizations seem to be kind of on board, but more seem to be resistant to updating the complexity of their help desk.
So he made the comment that broadly there's increased collaboration between security and IT, and this relies on that collaboration. But not all organizations want to do that, and there's some hesitancy with some organizations. So in those contexts, I would probably adjust it and have IT do the validation and the checks. But ideally, those would be, I think, separated out. So yeah, that was great. Any other questions or comments? What? Okay, great. Yeah, so the question from Discord is they like the idea of having a second employee go and check in on that employee who's being impersonated. But what do you do if nobody lives around them? Could you call law enforcement and have them do a wellness check? In those cases, I don't know. I don't want to give out legal advice because if we're involving the police, then it's legal. So I would check with your company's legal team on that. From a practical standpoint, you could. I'm kind of hesitant because I assume if you involve the police, it might involve some more paperwork or other stuff. But as always, if you have reason to believe that your employee is in physical danger, then yeah, it's a good idea to take steps to keep them safe. Again, I am not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice, but just as a general thought. So I think there was another question. Yeah.